You're lying down, ready to rest, and the gods, well, they're not that different. At least not in the earliest tales we told about them. Take Apollo, for instance, god of music, healing, prophecy, and the sun. You might imagine him striding through marble temples or beaming gloriously from mountaintops. But once, in the sleepy time before myths got formalized and polished, Apollo was, for lack of a better word, employed. This is the story of the time the god of sunlight had to do something as mundane as watching over cows. Not golden, mythical cows, just regular, mortal ones. It was a sort of divine punishment, or maybe a misunderstanding. The myths are blurry, as they tend to be when passed through centuries of retellings. But what remains, surprisingly, is a quiet little tale tucked deep inside the folds of Greek mythology, a moment when immortality paused, and a god was made to clock in like the rest of us. Let's begin, setting the stage. A world before order, before Apollo was ever sent down to herd cows. He'd already been a bit of a show-off. Born of Leto and Zeus, he was precocious from birth. No sooner had he arrived into the world on the island of Delos than he started making claims to everything under the sun, mostly because he was the sun. But the gods of Olympus had rules, some unspoken, some loud and shouted, and one of them, though not carved in stone, was that you don't go around killing divine workers. And that's exactly what Apollo did. He slew a serpent, not just any snake, but Python, the guardian of Delphi, the sacred center of prophecy. Now, to be fair, Python had been chasing his mother Leto all over Greece during her pregnancy. So Apollo wasn't exactly without reason, but gods rarely take vengeance lightly, especially when it disrupts divine operations. And Python, according to older myths, had been a kind of emissary for Gaia, the earth itself. So when Apollo slayed the creature in one of his early acts of godhood, he was punished not by thunderbolt or exile, but by being sent to work, and not just anywhere, but in the service of a mortal, a king named Admetus. Yes, the blazing god of harmony and prophecy was demoted to shepherd, cattle custodian, bovine babysitter. Who was Admetus, and why cows? Admetus, king of Pherai in Thessaly, was by all accounts a decent man. He wasn't known for conquests or cruelty. He ruled a small, respectable city-state and occasionally got involved in bigger matters, like trying to win the hand of Alcestis, one of the cleverest women in Greek mythology. More on her later. What mattered for this particular story was that Admetus was kind to Apollo. There's a version of the myth that says Apollo served Admetus for a full year. Another says it was 9 years. Still another says it was only a few months. But the cows were particularly ornery. What matters, again, is not the time frame, but the fact that Apollo took the job seriously. He didn't show up in golden chariots. He didn't refuse the work. He didn't try to turn the cows into dolphins or liars. He did what he was asked. He herded them, according to fragments recorded by later writers Plutarch, Lucian, and Pindar. Among them Apollo even used his divine music to calm the cattle. The same music that healed the sick and inspired the Oracle of Delphi was now keeping cows from wandering into thorn bushes or falling into ravines. There is, strangely, a kind of peace in that image. The god of blazing light, walking barefoot through a pasture, whistling a celestial tune while dozens of cows blink slowly in the afternoon sun. He's barefoot because leather sandals squeak when wet, and Apollo was always near streams. He carries a shepherd's crook because you can't very well direct cows with a bow and arrow. And he speaks softly to them, because cows don't care for shouting. In a world where Greek gods usually announce themselves with fanfare and thunder, this episode is oddly man, a god among mortals. Now imagine you're a mortal farmer in 8th century BCE Thessaly. You pass by the royal estate and see a beautiful young man herding cattle. His face seems to glow a little, though it's probably the morning mist. His hair is braided not in the style of your region, but in some older, half-forgotten way. You ask who he is, and someone says, "Oh, that's Admeta's new cowherd." That's it. No recognition, no temples, just a god doing a mortal's job. There are many interpretations of why this myth exists. Some say it was meant to humble the gods, to show that even divine figures must atone. Others say it was meant to elevate the role of the shepherd, to suggest that even mundane labor had value. And some, perhaps the most insightful of all, say it was simply a good story to tell children when they complained about chores. If Apollo could herd cows, so can you. The boring but important logistics of ancient Greek cowherding now. Let's step away from the myth and into the world behind it. In ancient Greece, cattle were among the most valuable forms of wealth. Not only did they provide milk, hides, and labor, but they were also symbolic of prestige. To be entrusted with the care of cattle was not insignificant. A Greek cowherd, known as a boukalos, had a job that started before dawn. He'd lead the cattle from the pen to pasture, ensuring none strayed, were stolen, or injured. He needed to know the terrain intimately, where wild herbs grew, which streams dried in midsummer, and which hillsides were prone to rockfall. In regions like Thessaly, pastures could be both high and dry, especially during the hotter months. So grazing routes were seasonal and memorized like song lyrics. A good herdsman knew when to move his animals, how to treat hoof rot, and which plants were safe if the grass was thin. Apollo, in this story, is said to have been exceptionally good at it. He never lost a cow. No calves were born sick. Wolves and bandits, it's whispered, avoided the pasture entirely, not because they feared Apollo, but because they simply forgot where the field was. Such was the god's aura of calm and forgetfulness. A world where divine punishment was also quiet work. So, here we are, halfway through this pastoral tale of mythological demotion. Apollo is not angry. He's not trying to escape. He wakes up early, eats a mortal breakfast, barley cakes, maybe olives, and walks into the field. There's a strange dignity in it. And while the other gods might smirk from Olympus or wonder when he'll get back to real work, he continues with his task, quietly, daily, without complaint. No chariot, no fanfare, no oracle, just Apollo, a few cows, and the morning mist. But why did Admetus treat him so well? Why does the god stay beyond his sentence? What exactly happened between them that left such an impression on mythology? These are the questions the next part of the story will gently unravel. So now you're imagining Apollo, barefoot in the fields, humming something divine, yet vaguely pastoral, watching over the Sally's cows. But this wasn't just any herd, and this wasn't just any man he was serving under. This was King Admetus of Phera, mortal king with a soft heart, and it would turn out a difficult fate. Admetus is not one of the more famous kings of Greek mythology. He ruled no vast empire, fought no monumental battles, and commanded no armies across seas. But what he did have what the myths keep reminding us was a rare kind of gentleness. and for a brief period he had the company of a god who, for once, had nothing better to do. Faerie, a kingdom of modest means and quiet cattle. The kingdom of Faerie was not exactly bustling. It was set inland, far from the sweeping naval epics and bustling trade ports of Athens or Corinth. Thessaly, the region where Faerie lay, was a place of plains and mountain land, known for horse breeders, long-legged shepherd dogs, and towns where not much ever happened. This may be part of why Apollo's story settled here. Myths, after all, don't always occur in the centers of power. Sometimes they unfold in the margins, in cow pastures and quiet courtyards, far from the marble glare of Olympus. Admetus' palace, by most accounts, was unassuming. There were no elaborate mosaics or columns etched with gold, but it had stables, olive trees, and several grazing enclosures just outside the city walls. And according to some versions, it had one curious cowherd who didn't quite look like the rest. Admetus, the hospitable Greek mythology, has a particular fondness for Xenia, the ancient code of hospitality. Zeus himself was said to be the protector of strangers, and stories abound of gods testing mortals by arriving disguised at their doors. The way you treated a guest or a beggar or a laborer reflected on your worth as a ruler. And this is where Admetus shines. Unlike so many kings who turned away strangers, sent servants to deal with laborers, or treated workers as invisible, Admetus is said to have welcomed Apollo kindly. Whether or not he knew the true identity of his shepherd is debated by scholars and storytellers alike. Some say Apollo revealed himself. Others claim he stayed anonymous, using one of those suspiciously poetic pseudonyms the gods favored, something like Lykios, which, incidentally, means of the wolves, but also refers to light. In any case, Admetus didn't mock him or demand divine favors. He gave him clean clothes, a place to sleep, and, most importantly, his trust. It's this trust that makes the story take its next, quietly extraordinary turn. Apollo and the herd that never dwindled. There are multiple references scattered across ancient texts that Apollo, while working for Admetus, blessed the king's cattle. The herd multiplied. No illnesses swept through. Even the milk was richer, the calves fatter, and the oxen stronger than any other in Thessaly. This wasn't because Apollo snapped his fingers and summoned more cows. It was subtler than that. Myth suggests he simply cared. He watched them closely. He kept predators away with music. He rotated pastures more carefully than even the most seasoned herdsman. He watered the animals gently, waiting for each one to finish, never rushing the process. You might think this sounds suspiciously romantic. And yes, there is an elegance to it, a dreamy quality. But if you've ever spent time around livestock, you'll know how much calmer they are around steady, quiet people. And Apollo, with his music and stillness, was perhaps the ultimate calming presence. It wasn't just the cows who responded to him. Admetus began to notice. A friendship forged in quiet moments. There are very few written records about what conversations took place between Admetus and Apollo during this time. But that's partly what makes it compelling. You have to imagine them, the king and the shepherd, sitting outside at dusk, watching the cattle settle. Admetus, a man used to ruling but rarely commanding. Apollo, a god used to commanding but now content to listen. Perhaps they spoke of dreams, of fate, of music. Perhaps Admetus shared stories of his youth, his regrets, or his hesitations about ruling. Perhaps Apollo said very little at all. There is something restful about a friendship where silence is part of the bond. In some tellings, Admetus played the lyre, not well, but earnestly, and Apollo would nod, never correcting him, never showing off. Sometimes he would tune it when the string slipped, just that. There's one particular line in Euripides' version of the Alcestis myth that hints at the bond. Apollo, though a god, was tamed by the kindness of this house. Think about that. Not by thunder or prophecy, not by chains or curses, but by kindness. The question of immortality. Here's where the story takes a subtle turn. After Apollo completed his penance, he could have returned immediately to Olympus. He'd served his sentence, paid for Python's death, and his radiant reputation remained largely intact. But he didn't leave immediately. He stayed, and most importantly, he intervened. You see, around this time, Admetus had a problem. He wanted to marry Alcestis, the famously clever daughter of King Peleus. But Peleus, never one to make things simple, set a condition. Admetus could only marry her if he arrived at her palace in a chariot pulled by lions and boars. Not horses, not oxen, lions and boars. An impossible task. Unless, of course, you happened to know a god who had once herded your cows. The impossible chariot and the gift of the divine Apollo, whether out of friendship or lingering guilt, helped. He found the animals no mean feat and tamed them with music. He yoked them to a chariot and guided Admetus safely to Peleus' court. Admetus, needless to say, won the hand of Alcestis. But that's not where the story ends. Because despite winning the marriage, Admetus would soon find himself facing death. The fates had declared that his time was nearly up, and this, again, is where Apollo stepped in. He tried to change fate. He pleaded with the fates, those stern, thread-cutting weavers of destiny, to spare Admetus. They refused. So Apollo, determined to help, struck a deal. If someone could be found to die in Admetus' place, the king could live. No one volunteered, no one, except Alcestis. The shadow of the next story, the myth of Alcestis, her self-sacrifice, descent toward death, and the eventual intervention of Heracles to bring her back, is its own full tale, and will come later in this series. But what matters now is that this whole episode may never have happened if not for a strange, quiet year when a god decided to herd cows and found himself in the company of a kind mortal king. Apollo did not prevent death forever. He did not rewrite the stars. But he did something smaller, quieter, and perhaps more touching. He tried. And in Greek mythology, where gods are often indifferent or vengeful, that's worth noting. But we're left with a question. After all this, after the chariot, why did he take on that labor when he could have protested? Was it truly punishment, or something else? And what did Apollo learn, if anything, about mortality from mortals? By now, you've followed Apollo through a gentle kind of exile. You've walked with him past dewdamp fields, watched him tend cattle, not because he had to, but because, eventually, he chose to. You've seen the unlikely friendship that grew between a mortal king and a divine being, a friendship so sincere it tilted the mythological scales, if only slightly. But myths, like dreams, don't linger forever. Eventually, the god returns to Olympus. The cows, however well fed, don't remain central to the story, and Admetus, he fades back into the footnotes of Greek legend, known best not for his crown, but for his capacity to make a god feel welcome. So what happens next? What did Apollo take with him when he finally returned to his perch in the heavens? Let's pause a moment and walk through the final pasture together. The return to Olympus. Some versions of the myth end the moment Apollo departs ferry. No grand farewell, no celestial procession, just a shepherd disappearing with the dawn. Others add a slightly more ceremonial exit perhaps. Admetus woke one morning to find Apollo gone, his crook leaning gently against the fence, a faint scent of laurel and light still clinging to the air. There are even a few ancient commentators who claim that Apollo lingered invisibly in the city long after, watching from the shadows, perhaps checking in on the herd or humming quietly at night, while the wind passed through the palace courtyard. But in all tellings, Apollo returns to Olympus changed. He had, after all, lived like a mortal. He had worked, he had waited, listened. And for a god whose traditional role was to declare through oracles, music, and prophecy, that's no small shift. Apollo after the fields, a new kind of divinity. Greek mythology paints its gods in broad, archetypal strokes: Zeus as the wielder of thunder, Hera as the protector of marriage, Ares as blood-soaked rage, and Apollo as light, reason, and order. But Apollo, after Fairy, begins to appear differently in some stories. He becomes gentler, more measured. His music, once overpowering, becomes healing. His prophecies, once cryptic, become softer and more reflective. At Delphi, where he replaces the slain Python as the ruling divine presence, his messages are layered with subtlety, not decree. He doesn't try to dominate fate. Instead, he tries to bend around it, just as he did when he bargained with the fates to spare Admetus. Think about that. A god who once thought he could do anything learns that some things, like death, like love, like time, aren't his to control. And yet, he still tries, not with thunderbolts, but with empathy. The mortal influence on the immortal. Why did this small chapter in his myth endure? Why, of all things, did the ancient poets keep repeating this curious story of the time Apollo was made to herd cows? The ancient Greeks didn't have comic strips, they didn't have podcasts, but they did have dinner stories, temple carvings, and long philosophical walks, where such tales were shared like soft bread broken, passed, savored slowly. This myth lingered because it was comforting. It reminded people that even gods could be humbled, that work, no matter how ordinary, could hold quiet dignity. And that kindness, above all, had power even over the divine. Apollo didn't stay in Phare because he had to. He stayed because, perhaps for the first time in his long mythic life, he was treated not as a god, but as a person. And that may have been what he needed. The mythic echo, why the cows still matter to modern ears. The story may sound light, even comical. A solar deity doing chores, the mighty Apollo shoveling manure. But remember, Greek myths were often layered. The surface might glitter with absurdity, but underneath flowed something deeper. This story isn't really about cows, it's about attention, about what happens when a being who sees all finally looks closely at something small. When he realizes that tending to the ordinary day in and day out can be as sacred as prophecy or poetry. There's even a strange theological undercurrent here, especially in later philosophical circles. The idea that gods, too, might need to reconnect with the world they supposedly rule, that eternity could grow sterile, if not occasionally refreshed by the grit of mortal life. What mortals remember. Admetus, despite being a minor king, left behind a surprisingly strong mythic footprint, not because he conquered anything, Not because he built great monuments, but because he once welcomed a stranger, offered him kindness, and treated him with respect, regardless of status. Later, poets and playwrights returned to him not as a hero, but as a symbol, the just king, the quiet one, the man who knew how to listen, even when he didn't know who he was listening to. Some even say that after Alcestis' near-death sacrifice, after Heracles intervened and brought her back, Admetus changed again. He ruled more gently. He gave up hunting. He spent more time among his people. And he always made sure his shepherds had enough olive oil, enough wool, and enough rest. You won't find his name inscribed on surviving temples. But if you listen to the oldest fragments of oral poetry, his story remains soft-spoken, unadorned, real. And what the listener might learn now, as you're lying here, listening to this slow stream of antiquity, it might be tempting to ask, what does any of this matter? What use is a god herding cows, or a forgotten king who played the lyre badly? But maybe, like Apollo, you don't need a grand answer. Maybe it's enough to understand that the world is shaped not only by thunder and conquest, but also by years spent doing ordinary things quietly, well, and without complaint. Maybe this is where wisdom starts, not in oracles or temples, but in the fields. And maybe, just maybe, the next time you do something dull or repetitive, you'll remember that once the God of light did the same and found peace in it. One last thought to drift on. Apollo returned to Olympus eventually. The cows went back to mortal care. The lyre was tuned one last time. But imagine, just for a moment, if he missed it. Not the glory, not the praise, but the morning mist, the grass underfoot, the quiet affection of animals who had no idea who he was and didn't care. They just wanted to be led to water. It's a thought that never quite leaves the myth, a question that hovers. If you were a god, would you ever want to come back down? Before he was the messenger of the gods, before he guided souls to the underworld, or served as the protector of merchants and thieves, Hermes was a newborn, a literal infant, wrapped in swaddling cloth and cradled in a cave on Mount Selene. And on the very first day of his life, less than a full turn of the sun from his divine birth, Hermes did what many children do. He got bored. But unlike human babies who cry or nap, Hermes decided to invent music. This is, of course, not the dramatic kind of music associated with divine choirs or heavenly orchestras. No, the lyre he created was a rustic, improvised thing fashioned from a turtle shell, a few sticks, and the guts of cows he had recently stolen from his half-brother Apollo. Yes, that's right. The Greek god Hermes, later known for guiding travelers, was a cattle thief before he could walk. To understand this bizarre but charming myth, we need to begin with the essentials, the setting, the materials, and the motives. The setting. A cave and a tortoise. Mount Selene sits in Arcadia, an isolated, forested region of the Peloponnesus, known more for shepherds and strange weather than for great battles or temples. It was a landscape of caves and silence, where nymphs whispered and clouds clung to treetops. Hermes was born in one such cave, remote, unguarded, and forgettable to anyone not closely following mythic genealogies. His mother, Maia, was a minor goddess, one of the Pleiades. She lived quietly, far from Olympus, and perhaps hoped her son would do the same. But Hermes had other plans. Within hours of birth, he had grown restless, and that's when he spotted the tortoise. To the modern ear, it seems a strange starting point for a legend. A tortoise is slow, plain, and profoundly unmusical. But in early Greek rural life, tortoises were common creatures. Farmers sometimes used their shells for bowls, children poked at them with sticks, and shepherds occasionally took them as omens of stability. To Hermes, though, this one was something more, the perfect shape for sound. According to the Homeric hymn to Hermes, the baby god picked up the tortoise, examined its dome-shaped shell, and without any hesitation killed it. He cleaned it out, removed the flesh, and dried the hollow shell in the sun. The hymn is unusually specific here, not because it glorifies cruelty, but because it reflects a kind of practical reverence. Animals in ancient Greece were not sacred in the way we think of pets today. They were tools, symbols, and occasionally instruments. The tortoise, having lived a slow and quiet life, was about to become the unlikely birthplace of divine music. The materials, cowgut, twine, and improvisation. Once Hermes had the shell, he needed strings. And this is where the story takes a detour, one that adds another layer of tedium and trouble. Hermes, still only a day old, decided to steal a herd of cattle. Not just any cattle, but the prized sacred herd of Apollo, the god of sunlight, music, and order. A bold move for someone still in diapers. He crawled, or perhaps toddled, accounts differ, out of the cave at night, and found Apollo's herd grazing peacefully in Pieria, with the kind of logic that only gods or very determined toddlers possess. Hermes reversed the hooves of the cows so their tracks would point in the wrong direction, confusing any would-be trackers. He then led them south, quietly and slowly, and hid them in a nearby cave. Along the way, he slaughtered to cowsnot out of hunger, but for materials. He stretched their intestines to use as strings for his new instrument. Here, Greek myth enters a stage of incredible, almost comical detail. He used reeds for pegs. He tied the sinews tightly across the shell. He attached a simple wooden frame to stretch the strings. None of this was elegant. The lyre was not gilded or adorned with jewels. It was, by all accounts, a crude object shaped by practical knowledge, by childish resourcefulness, and by a clear need to do something with his hands. The music it made was equally unremarkable at first. The strings were uneven. The sound was raw, twangy, unpredictable, but it was music, and more importantly, it was something new. This may be the most overlooked aspect of the myth. Hermes did you invent the lyre because he was trying to be profound. He did it because he was restless, because he needed a distraction, because divine childhood, like mortal childhood, was filled with long hours and limited entertainment. In other words, the lyre was born out of boredom. The motive, not genius, just mischief. Modern retellings sometimes frame Hermes as a kind of divine prodigy, a savant who invented art on his first day of life. But the ancient texts suggest something more mundane. The lyre, at least at first, wasn't meant to uplift the soul or guide ritual. It was a bargaining chip. When Apollo eventually discovered the theft of his Cataland, followed the confused hoofprints back to the cave, he found Hermes swaddled and pretending to be asleep. Apollo, furious, demanded justice. Hermes denied everything. The scene is bizarre. A radiant god arguing with an infant who can barely hold up his head. But instead of escalating the conflict into thunderbolts and trials, Hermes offered the lyre as a gift, not as an apology, but as a distraction, a trade. Here, take this strange thing I made. See what it does. Apollo plucked the strings. The sound stopped him. For all his anger, For all his righteous fury over the missing cattle, he was enchanted, not completely calmed, but disarmed. The music wasn't perfect, but it was new. The lyre, in all its crude construction, had a voice. Apollo accepted the instrument. In return, he forgave Hermes. He even granted him a place among the gods. But the moment was transactional. This wasn't art for art's sake. It was art as leverage. The birth of divine music began not in ceremony, but in a barter. The boring brilliance of the lyre, what follows in myth, is predictable. Hermes grows into his role as a trickster and messenger. Apollo perfects the lyre and brings it to Olympus. It becomes an instrument of poetry, prophecy, and praise. But the origin, the slow scraping of gut against shell, the uneven stretch of sinew, the repurposed carcass of a tortoise is often forgotten. That's the nature of creation stories. We remember the spark, not the long, dull friction that produced it. Yet there is something comforting in the fact that one of the most enduring symbols of Greek civilizations, the lyre, the basis for lyric poetry, the tool of Orpheus and Pindar, began as a toddler's fidget project. It reminds us that great things often have boring beginnings, and that innovation, far from being the work of pure genius, is often the result of limited resources, idle time, and the strange energy that comes from not knowing what else to do. So what do we make of Hermes, lying in a cave, fiddling with animal remains and twine? Is he a symbol of youthful invention, a reminder that music can emerge from mischief, or just a bored child trying to pass the time? As the wind blew through Mount Selene that day, with the muffled bellows of stolen cattle echoing from distant hills, a quiet sound joined it, the first true strumming of a lyre. It wasn't beautiful, not yet, but it was music, and it had begun. Which leaves us with a quiet question. If music started as a distraction, what did the gods first use it to forget? By now, you've met Hermes at his most impish, dialed godlet, who, rather than nap like a normal baby, decided to reverse engineer music and commit grand theft bovine, where consequences start to catch up, and where gods, like mortals, must explain themselves. This part of the story often gets skipped in flashy The theft is amusing, the lyre is iconic. But what happened in between the accusations, the finger-pointing, the tedious, divine arbitration is where the real story unfolds. It wasn't glorious, it was administrative, bureaucratic even, because when a child steals sacred cattle, even if he is a god, someone has to file a complaint. The divine complaint system. How Olympus handled petty crimes. Apollo, it must be said, was not used to being disrespected. God of prophecy, healing, sunlight, and sacred order. He was accustomed to peopleland, gods doing what he said, or at least pretending to. So when he found his cattle missing, and the hoofprints leading in the wrong direction, he was affronted not only by the crime, but by the cleverness of it. Someone had thought this through. He followed the trail, muddled though it was, and eventually ended up in Arcadia, specifically, back at the cave of Maia and her newborn son. The very newborn son, the hours-old infant, who, by all logic, should not have been capable of complex deception. But Hermes had anticipated this moment. When Apollo arrived, Hermes curled into his blankets, made gurgling noises, and feigned ignorance. According to the Homeric hymn to Hermes, he even delivered a mock-serious monologue in which he denied all charges, accused Apollo of slander, and insisted he couldn't possibly have stolen the cows because, well, he didn't even know what a cow was. To recap, a god accused a baby of cattle theft, and the baby gave a speech in his own defense. This could have ended there with Apollo storming off in exasperation, or Hermes relenting. But instead, the situation escalated. Apollo, infuriated but uncertain, decided to escalate the matter formally. He picked up the baby, marched back to Olympus, and requested an official hearing before Zeus. Yes, a formal divine hearing over cattle. Zeus's role: arbitrator, father, and very tired boss. Zeus was many things: storm god, philanderer, patriarch, and occasionally judge. He didn't love these minor squabbles. Most of his time was spent mediating divine rivalries, punishing mortals for hubris, or trying to keep the Titans locked away. But family drama was unavoidable, and Hermes, as his son, was now his administrative responsibility. Apollo made his case clearly. The tracks were tampered with. The trail led directly to Maha's cave, and Hermes, despite being a mere infant, was the only plausible suspect. He demanded retribution. Zeus turned to Hermes, still swaddled, still blinking with mock innocence. And here, the myth slows down again, because Hermes didn't apologize. He didn't admit guilt. Instead, he offered something far more complex: charm. He spoke elegantly, if absurdly, about the situation. He flattered Zeus. He flattered Apollo. He downplayed the damage. And then, with a flourish, he pulled out the lyre. Rather than argue further, Hermes played. He strummed a few uneven notes, still raw, still not quite refined on, began to sing. Not a hymn, but a story. Some say it was about his own birth. Others claim it was a song about the day, about the wind, about clouds drifting above Olympus. Apollo, standing there with his complaint still fresh, softened. Zeus, amused by the audacity, smiled. This was not justice in any mortal sense. There were no laws, no verdicts, no punishment. And so, a deal was struck. The first divine trade deal: cattle for culture. Hermes offered the lyre to Apollo as compensation. Apollo, immediately recognizing the instrument's potential, accepted. In return, he gave Hermes, the cattle, or rather, stopped pursuing their return. Later accounts say Apollo went a step further. He gifted Hermes a golden staff, the caduceus, which became his signature emblem. He also, somewhat begrudgingly, endorsed Hermes's ascension into the Olympian pantheon, not as a son to be hidden away, but as an official god with duties and titles. Hermes, still in his infancy, was now divine messenger, god of roads, god of merchants, god of thieves. The titles, once again, sound grand, but at their core, they're deeply practical. Hermes became responsible for communication, for transactions. A god of loopholes from that point forward, Hermes became the deity associated with movement, not just physical movement, but conceptual mobility. He governed messages, borders, exchanges, and transitions. All the little spaces where systems meet and fail. This role fit him perfectly. Who better to govern speech than the infant who out-argued a sun god? Hermes became a master of thresholds, doorways, paths, markets, cemeteries. Every place where change occurred, where definitions blurred, became his domain. And yet, unlike other gods, Hermes never developed a cult of grandeur. His temples were small. His followers were travelers, tradespeople, poets, those on the margins. He preferred cleverness, quiet competence, and, occasionally, a well-timed joke. In a world of war gods and thunder gods and sea gods, Hermes remained grounded. Why the lyre was forgotten? In most stories, Once Apollo receives the lyre, Hermes rarely plays it again. The instrument becomes Apollo's. Under his hand, it becomes refined, used in temples, paired with choral hymns. Elevated to the heights of sacred art, Hermes moves on to other things. He invents more tools. Some sources credit him with sandals, astronomy, even weights and measures. He becomes the prototype for civilization's glue, the inventor god. But the lyre remains his first creation. And perhaps he never returned to it because he didn't need to. Hermes didn't crave worship through music. He craved motion, utility, efficiency. His gift wasn't in art. The lyre, in that sense, was never the point. It was just the first in a long line of necessary improvisations. A moment at the edge of myth, if you look closely, buried in the folds of the Homeric hymns. There's a brief, an almost overlooked moment. A line where Hermes, after handing over the lyre, steps outside the meeting of the gods. He's still a child, still new to the world. He sits at the edge of Olympus and watches the clouds. We don't know what he thinks. Maybe nothing, maybe everything. But it's one of the few moments in myth where a god simply ... pauses. No trickery, no theft, no invention, just stillness. And in that stillness, we see the space between function and reflection, between mischief and meaning, between a baby and a god. Which leaves us with a question. If creativity begins in chaos, what happens after the invention is finished, when the silence returns? By now, Hermes has made his mark. Invented the lyre, stolen a herd of sacred cattle, talked his way out of a formal complaint, and been given a job. Not a throne, not a kingdom, just a role. He was now the divine liaison, the god of all in-between things. But this wasn't a retirement story. Hermes didn't settle into a single function. Instead, he began a quiet, lifelong pattern of motion use. No battles, no epic betrayals, just centuries of continuous, small-scale invention and intervention. This final section isn't about the peak of his career, it's about what came after. The parts of the myth that don't involve miracles or murder, but maintenance. Because Hermes didn't become famous for what he destroyed. He became essential for what he kept running. Hermes in the margins. A career of quiet appearances. Unlike his more flamboyant siblings, Hermes didn't seek the center of every myth. You won't find him leading armies like Ares, or punishing mortals like Hera. He shows up on the edges just before someone crosses a line, just after someone dies, just as a deal is being made. In Homer's Odyssey, Hermes appears briefly to help Odysseus survive the enchantments of Circe. He offers a herb moly, bitter and magical, that protects the hero from transformation, and then he vanishes. In the Iliad, Hermes assists King Priam in slipping into the Greek camp to beg Achilles for his son's body. He acts not as a warrior, but as a guided divine escort across enemy lines, offering safe passage through a human tragedy. These moments matter, not because they're explosive, but because they demonstrate consistency, reliability. Hermes doesn't demand offerings. He shows up when movement is needed, when a soul is lost, when a bargain teeters, when a path must be found. He doesn't ask to be the center of the story. He makes sure the story keeps moving. The psychopomp, escort of the dead, one of Hermes' later and lesser discussed roles, is that of psychopomp, guide of souls. It sounds glamorous. In truth, it was a quiet, melancholy duty. When mortals died, their souls needed escort from the world of the living to the underworld. Not forcibly, just ... gently. Someone had to walk them to the riverbank, help them cross, and ensure they didn't get lost in the mist. Hermes did that, not Hades, not Charon, Hermes. He became the first and last presence a soul might encounter on its journey, not to judge, not to condemn, but simply to accompany. This wasn't a role assigned with fanfare. It's not mentioned in the flashier myths, but it was deeply important, and it fit his nature, neither fully of the heavens, nor of the earth, nor of the underworld, always in between. He moved between all three, without complaint, without hesitation. A god not of power, but of passage, invention as maintenance. If you trace the later fragments and local cult practices tied to Hermes, you'll notice a pattern. His worship is seldom extravagant. He was honored at crossroads with hermstone pillars, often adorned with a carved head and a conspicuous phallus, meant to mark boundaries and ensure safe travel. These weren't grand temples. They were functional markers, ways to bless motion, to give form to the concept of transition. Hermes also acquired new inventions: the alphabet, astronomy, mathematics. Some myths credit him with the first coin, others say he invented diplomacy. None of these are dramatic, but they are essential. They form the scaffold of daily civilization. Unlike gods who represented primal forces, fire, war, Sea Hermes became the god of civilization's utilities, not the storm, the logistics team. Why boring gods endure? Most Greek gods reflect extremes: wrath, fertility, war, wisdom. They personify grand human emotions or elemental forces. Hermes didn't. He represented infrastructure, things that don't inspire poetry, but make life bearable: speech, trade, communication, movement, delivery. He didn't command armies, he organized them. He didn't create life, he helped escort it to safety. Even his symbols, the winged sandals, the caduceus staff, the traveler's capart, weapons, their tools, items of convenience, signs that someone is here to get things done. And perhaps this is why Hermes, among all the Olympians, remained one of the most quietly beloved across ancient Greece. He wasn't terrifying, he was relatable. And in a world where storms could kill, crops could fail, and war was never far off, there was comfort in knowing that someone, somewhere, was looking after the roads. The legacy of motion. In later centuries, Hermes would undergo transformations. In Roman times, he became Mercury, god of commerce, even faster, even slicker. In alchemical traditions, his name, Hermes Trismegistus, would become associated with secret wisdom, the fusion of Greek and Egyptian knowledge. But beneath all those masks remained the same idea: a god of movement. When systems broke, Hermes found a shortcut. When rules got too rigid, he found a loophole. When everyone else was frozen by formality, he acted, not recklessly, just. One final image, picture Hermes now, not as a baby, not as a messenger mid-flight, but as he might be on an ordinary day. He's walking a dirt road, not a gleaming highway, just a path. There's dust on his sandals. He stops to adjust a milestone marker that's fallen. He pats a child on the head, warns a merchant of a coming storm, drops a coin in a beggar's bowl. Nothing divine, nothing dramatic, just motion, one foot in front of the other. A thought to end on: we tend to celebrate the gods of power, the ones who roar, who punish, who stand still and demand worship. But Hermes, he moved, not because he had to, but because someone needed to. He didn't conquer, he delivered. And that might be why he lasted. So the next time you send a message, follow a signpost, or walk a path you've never taken, pause for just a moment. Imagine a quiet figure, just out of sight, making sure you arrive where you're meant to. A god of roads, a god of function, a god who never stopped inventing, even when no one was watching. You know Athena, or at least you think you do. She's often pictured fully armored, gaze sharp, with a spear in one hand and wisdom glowing faintly behind her eyes. Patron of strategy, of artisans, of rational thought. One of the most powerful and, ironically, most measured gods on Mount Olympus. But in this story, she's not waging war or weaving fate. She's in a civic dispute, not a dramatic standoff, not a battle with monsters. Justa, territorial disagreement. With some light landscaping, it all begins with a contest, a divine one, between Athena and Poseidon, god of seas, horses, and earthquakes, and the prize, a name, a city that would become famous, fierce, beloved, a city called Athens. But at this point in the story, it wasn't even a village, just a scraggly patch of land with a few streams, some rocky hills, and a handful of humans who hadn't yet invented sewers. Let's rewind the clock and look closer. A land with no name, long before marble temples and democratic assemblies. The region that would become Athens was simply a cluster of settlements atop hills. The largest of these was the Acropolis, just a high, stony rise in the land. The people were early farmers, goat herders, potters, and tool makers. Life was difficult, especially during dry seasons. The soil wasn't ideal. The heat was punishing, and the coastal winds brought more dust than relief. But the area had potential. The hills offered defense. The nearby sea allowed trade, and the scattered springs, though modest, could sustain a small population. So the gods took notice, and two of them, Poseidon and Athena, decided they wanted to lay claim to this upstart human settlement. But rather than just take it by force, as gods often did, they agreed under pressure from Zeus to hold a contest of gifts. Whoever could offer the better gift to the city would earn the right to be its patron. Poseidon's pitch. Poseidon went first. Now, if you're expecting a tsunami or a majestic sea creature, you're overestimating his audience. The people of the hill were inland. They liked boats, yes, but they weren't sailors. They needed water, but not salt water. Still, Poseidon was nothing if not dramatic. He raised his trident and struck a rock on the Acropolis. Instantly, a spring burst forth from the ground. Some versions say it was salt water. Others say it bubbled, pure and cold. In some tellings, the spring gushed and roared and dazzled the crowd. In others, it just ... trickled. Poseidon, proud of his display, gestured to the water and proclaimed it a source of naval power, of connection to the great seas, of wealth through trade and conquest. But the people squinted at it. No fish, no irrigation. And if it really was salty ... well, they already had the Aegean for that. Poseidon's spring was a marvel, but not terribly practical. Athena's turn. Then came Athena's turn. No thunder, no grand gesture, just a single act. She knelt and pressed her spear into the ground, and from that spot an olive tree sprouted, thin and gray-green, with narrow leaves and small fruit. It didn't roar. It didn't glitter. It just stood there. The crowd leaned in, perhaps unimpressed. But Athena explained. The wood could be used for tools, furniture, and shelter. The fruit could be pressed for oil, which could be used for cooking, lighting, and healing. The tree hardy and drought-resistant, would thrive where others might wither. It was not flashy, but it was deeply useful, and in time it would become indispensable. The judges decide the gods did not always defer to democracy, but in this case the people were consulted. They weighed the offerings, one flashy and immediate, the other modest but lasting, and they chose the olive tree. Athena became the patron of the city, which soon took her name, Athens. Poseidon, furious, struck the Acropolis again in rage, splintering stone and sending tremors through the hills. But the choice was made. From that day forward, Athena would protect the city not with floods or flame, but with ideas, guidance, and the occasional gentle push toward progress. And the olive tree, it stayed. Some said it was replanted many times. Others believed a single ancient tree still grew on the Acropolis, silent, gnarled, watching. A contest of needs, not spectacle. This myth, like many Greek stories, has more to it than divine ego. It's about values. Poseidon offered power. Athena offered sustainability. Poseidon offered movement. Athena offered roots. And the Athenians, despite their later reputation for glory and conquest, chose the gift that would nourish them quietly. The olive tree, after all, takes years to bear fruit. It must be pruned, protected, harvested, but once mature, it lives for centuries. It asks for patience and gives long-term reward. This wasn't a contest about magic. It was a referendum on what people needed to live. And in that sense, the myth is less about the gods and more about the humans. Bureaucracy of the divine. In later versions of the story, there are whispers of procedural drama. Some say a vote was taken. Men voted for Poseidon, women for Athena, and women, having one more vote, tipped the balance in Athena's favor. Poseidon, offended, demanded retribution. So the gods, or the men of the city, depending on the version, punished the women. No more voting rights, no more citizenship in their own names. It's a strange, bureaucratic addendum to a spiritual story, a hint that even mythology could unescape the realities of ancient civic life. The myth doesn't dwell on the violence, just the paperwork. Even in legend, civic participation came with consequences. The olive as civilization to modern ears. The olive tree might not seem miraculous, but in the ancient world, it represented civilization itself. To cultivate olives was to commit to land, to build a long-term food economy, to plan for future generations. And Athens, built around that ethos, would eventually become known not only for military power, but for philosophy, law, theater, architecture, and education. Athena didn't win by being beloved. She won by being useful. One last question before we continue there's an odd little mystery here. Why didn't Athena ever claim credit for the invention? Why didn't she demand temples in exchange for olive oil profits? Did she forget to patent it? Or did she simply think the gift was enough? And what does it say about power that the greatest offering from a god might be something so small, so silent, so agricultural? So, as you fall into rest tonight, picture the slender branches of that first olive tree swaying on a hot, dry hill. No thunder, no fire, just shade and time. You've already witnessed the contest: two gods, two gifts, and one quiet decision that would echo across centuries. Now, let's sit with what came next. The tree had been planted. The goddess had been chosen. The city had a name, but it didn't yet have a plan, because giving a name is one thing. Building a city around it, that's where the real work begins. After the olive tree, a city with no streets. The people of early Athens had accepted Athena's gift, but they didn't suddenly become philosophers or poets. They still had to tend goats, haul water, and survive dry summers. The olive tree gave them a future, yes, but it also demanded cultivation, and cultivation requires infrastructure. So the real question became, how do you build a city that can last long enough to honor a goddess? The early Athenians didn't start with marble or monuments. They started with mud brick homes, sheepfolds, and rough terracing. There were no streetlights, no aqueducts, and very few straight paths. If you wanted to go somewhere, you usually walked through someone else's field. Athena's olive was useful, but it didn't come with a zoning plan. So the citizens improvised. They built shrines from stone and timber, not just to Athena, but to any god who might listen. Demeter for grain, Hephaestus for tools, even Dionysus for fermented relief from all the planning. What grew wasn't a city in the modern sense. It was a mosaic of neighborhoods, potters' quarters, fishermen's markets, a slow and steady tangle of human intention stretching around the base of the Acropolis. And in the center of it all, the tree, the olive tree, as civic anchor by the 8th century BCE. That tree had become something more than a symbol. It was a civic landmark, a reminder of the pact between God and mortal. A reminder that this city was supposed to be different. In fact, there was an actual sacred olive tree on the Acropolis called the Moria Ilia. Moria meaning assigned or designated. Not a wild tree, but one considered the property of the state and under the watchful eye of Athena herself. From that tree, other sacred olives were planted across Attica. They were also called Moriae, and they couldn't be cut down not without legal permission and ritual consultation. Inspectors were appointed to check on them. Theft of a Moria olive could result in exile. This wasn't just agriculture. It was early environmental policy, rooted, quite literally, in myth. And so, gradually, Athens began to wrap its civic identity around this tree. Not around conquest, not yet, around resource management. And you thought mythology was all excitement and drama. The Parthenon, bureaucracy, in stone, eventually, of course, things got grander. By the 5th century BCE, the Athenians were prosperous enough to think about how they looked to the outside world. The Persian wars had come and gone. Athens had emerged as a naval power, and Pericles' statesman, strategist, and unintentional workaholic decided the city needed a facelift. At the center of it all would be the Parthenon. You might think of it as a temple, but to the Athenians, it was more than that. It was a treasury, a meeting place, a monument to civic pride, and above all, a giant, shining receipt proof that the goddess hadn't chosen them in vain. Inside the Parthenon stood a statue of Athena, robed in modesty, but armed in gold and ivory, towering nearly 40 feet tall. Her shield bore images of battle. Her helmet gleamed, and beside her, a small olive tree was carved into the frieze. A quiet reminder, dwarfed by marble, of how it all began. The irony. By this point, the olive tree wasn't the city's most valuable resource. That honor went to silver, mined in nearby Laurion. But the tree stayed in the stories because it had become a symbol not of wealth, but of endurance. Trees, temples, and tax policy, let's not romanticize too much. The Athenians were proud of their olive oil, but they were also very good at taxing it. In fact, the oil trade was one of the earliest regulated industries in Athens. Merchants who exported oil had to pay a fee to the state. Inspectors called estanaimoi checked weights, containers, and origin sources. If a merchant tried to pass off ordinary oil as sacred oil, i.e. from a Moria tree, they could be fined, or worse. So yes, Athena's gift was divine. But it also became, essentially, a regulated commodity. And just like modern bureaucracies, it came with licensing, inspection, legal codes, even olive fraud. Not exactly heroic stuff. But this is what happens when you root your civic identity in a tree. Eventually, you need people to manage the leaves. Poseidon's salt spring, forgotten but flowing now. Let's talk about the loser. Poseidon didn't win the contest, but he wasn't completely erased from the record. On the Acropolis, near the Erechtheion Temple, you can still find a spot called the Salt Spring of Poseidon. According to legend, it was where his trident struck the rock. The spring is more of a trickle, now barely visible, but it's there. Always has been. The Athenians didn't destroy it. They folded it into their architecture. In fact, the Erechtheion itself, strangely shaped, uneven temple, was built specifically to honor multiple sacred sites on one foundation. The olive tree of Athena, the salt spring of Poseidon, the tomb of King Cecrops, the city's mythical first ruler. In this way, the city didn't erase history, it layered it. Even in myth, even in civic pride, there was room for compromise. The spring stayed, it just became quieter, like a footnote made of stone. The god who gave, then left. Now, here's the quiet part that never makes the paintings. Athena gave the tree. The people built the city, but Athena herself, she rarely intervened again. Unlike gods, who meddled constantly, Zeus with his thunder, Ares with his brawling, Athena remained largely symbolic. She wasn't absent, but she wasn't intrusive. She had made her offering. The rest was up to the mortals. That's an odd kind of divinity, isn't it? Not omnipresent, not wrathful, just ... silently invested. There's a dignity to it, a kind of divine delegation, as if she trusted the humans to manage things on their own, knowing they would make mistakes, get entangled in politics, and probably overcharge for olives. But she gave them the tools and stepped back. Not many gods did that. What the olive meant to the ordinary Athenian, to the average citizen, the olive tree wasn't just a mythical heirloom. It was part of everyday survival. You lit your home with olive oil. You cooked with it. You bathed with it. You greased tools and offered it in rituals. You might work as a picker, a presser, a trader, or a potter, making amphorae to hold the oil. Entire lifetimes were spent managing, moving, and measuring that one simple product. Think about that. A tree that became not just sacred, but habitual. And that's where the myth comes full circle. Athena's greatest gift wasn't glory, it was maintenance. A daily, repetitive, unglamorous act of stewardship. You don't see that in frescoes, but it's what cities are built on. A thought before we close this section. We often think of gods as loud, commanding, triumphant, but sometimes the most enduring divine acts are the quiet ones. Not battles, not miracles, just ... patience. A tree, a temple, a trade route, a tax form. So, next time you taste olive oil or walk through an old city built on strange zoning laws, remember, there was once a contest, and the goddess who lost her patent never asked for royalties. By now, UVE followed a goddess from contest to consequence, from a single sapling sprouting on a sunlit rock to a city that slowly arranged itself around that gift. You've seen a myth morph into law, a sacred tree turn into trade. and a temple become a record, not of miracles, but of management. Now we move into the final stage of the story. What happened next? Not in myth, but in history. Not with thunder, but with paperwork. Because what Athena started, the Athenians had to maintain, and they did. For centuries, until, eventually, they couldn't. Athens, the city that kept choosing its name. It's easy to forget how many times cities are reborn. They burn, they crumble, they're conquered, they collapse under their own weight, and yet their names endure. Athens is one of the rare cities that has kept its name for over 3,000 years, but not without interruption. The first Athens was little more than a cluster of hilltop villages. Over time, it grew into a political experiment, a naval empire, a cultural behemoth. But then came the long decline: Spartan occupation, Macedonian oversight, Roman absorption, Byzantine retreat, Ottoman conquest. Through it all, the Acropolis stood, often crumbling, often abandoned, but still there, and the olive tree, the one that supposedly sprang from Athena's gift, that's the curious part. It kept being replanted. The replantings of the sacred olive, the first sacred olive tree, according to myth and early writers like Herodotus and Pausanias, was miraculously resilient. The Persians burned the Acropolis in 480 BC, but the tree, it's said, sprouted a new shoot the very next day. To the Athenians, this wasn't just a good omen, it was a sign that their goddess hadn't left. But olive trees are mortal. They rot, they fall to wind and time. So over the centuries, the Athenians did what any practical people would do. They replaced it, quietly, respectfully, sometimes ceremonially. But they always made sure a tree stood where Athena's was supposed to. Even in modern times, after wars and restorations, a replacement tree stands on the Acropolis, today planted in the 1950s, with saplings descended from older groves in the region. So the myth was never static. It was replanted again and again, not because anyone believed the tree was literally immortal, but because it had to be there. It was part of the story, and the story needed continuity, even if that meant a little gardening. The gods who stepped aside, Athena, doesn't appear much in the later history of Athens. Once the classical age faded, so did most of the Olympian pantheon. New gods arrived, first Roman, then Christian, then, in a way, none at all. But Athena never left completely. She stayed in statues, street names, and scholarly references. Her helmeted profile was carved into coins. Her owl remained a symbol of learning, wisdom, and watchfulness. And that's the oddest part of this myth. How a goddess who once intervened with a flourish of leaves gradually became an emblem, a figurehead, an idea. She didn't resist this change. She didn't demand worship. She simply allowed the city to carry her forward, quietly, symbolically, structurally. The gift had been given. The people had taken it. From there, it was their city, their laws, their burdens, their tree. Democracy and the olive grove. You've likely heard of the agora, the open-air marketplace at the heart of ancient Athens. But fewer people know about the olive groves of the academy, just outside the city walls. This is where Plato taught, where Aristotle walked, where politics, ethics, and natural science were debated under the shade of trees, many of which were believed to be descended from Athena's original grove. It's poetic, isn't it? The birthplace of democracy, of logic and reason and dialectic, rooted in trees given by a goddess who prized skill and foresight over spectacle. Athena didn't win her city with a storm or a flood. She won it with a try-a-long game. And in the end, that's what democracy is. A long game, full of slow growth, deep roots, bitter harvests, occasional pruning. It's not thrilling, but it works until someone forgets how to tend it. The tree as a measure of time. Today, when tourists visit the Acropolis, most barely notice the olive tree. It's not particularly grand. No sign says, "This is the one." There are better photo spots, higher views, shinier stones, but the tree is still there, still growing, still quietly outliving generations of passersby. You could look at it as a relic, or you could look at it as a record, a measure of how long an idea can last, provided someone tends it. Cities fall, statues erode, but trees, if you let them, come back. Not exactly the kind of glory most gods aim for, but it was the kind Athena chose. What the listener might take from this: you might not live in a city as old as Athens. You might not walk past olive groves on your way to work, but chances are you live in a place that once grew from a story. All cities start with a gift, a river, a crossroads, a harbor, a field, sometimes a myth, and then someone builds something, a market, a house, a shrine, and from there a place takes shape. Athens just happened to remember its story longer than most. Not because the myth was dazzling, but because it was useful, practical. That's the thing with so-called boring stories. They last. One last olive thought to drift on: if Athena ever looks down at her city, now past the rooftops, the traffic, the apartment blocks, and neon signs, maybe she sees something familiar. Not the Parthenon, not the plaques or statues, but that one olive tree, still standing in the sun, slightly crooked, sometimes overlooked, but alive. And maybe, just maybe, that was the point all along.